as well. And in particular, you have to be careful when there are two classes of nutrients that tend to go along with cholesterol. One is the essential fatty acids, which now you read all about omega-3. Well, that's an essential fatty acid. So you want to be careful if you put somebody on a low cholesterol diet to ensure that you don't inadvertently eliminate omega-3 fatty acids from their diet. The other class of nutrients that tend to go along with cholesterol are oil-soluble vitamins. Now so a low-fat diet, which is often virtually synonymous with low cholesterol, may also be limited in the oil-soluble vitamins. The one that's most important from the standpoint of hemolytic disease is vitamin D. Calcium and vitamin D are important, and they're particularly important in people who are not moving around a lot, because bone tends to leach out the minerals in inactive people, to the point where if someone is bedridden, the bones may become so, the minerals in the bone may become washed out so much that they will develop fractures. And the fractures, by the way, are generally painless, and they're often discovered quite incidentally when you try to move the patient and you can feel the bones rubbing, which is not a pleasant experience, but it's generally not harmful either. But some of the ensuring an adequate intake of calcium and vitamin D is critical. This can usually be met just by an ordinary multivitamin preparation. You don't have to specifically increase vitamin D and calcium. But so about adequate water intake, adequate intake of calories with a reasonable a normal distribution between fat, carbohydrate, and protein. Thank you. Thank you. That won't be on the test. And finally, I wanted to finish up with a few words about emotional component of nutrition or feeding. You know, in all my experience with people who, where the discussion of gastroscopy has come up, this has been one of the most emotional kinds of conversations I've ever had, because we assign a lot of emotion to the act of dining. And in some cultures, dining assumes enormous social and emotional importance. For parents, this is the one thing that you can do for your child. It's instinctive in us to provide our children with adequate nutrition, and this is generally associated with eating. And I think to ignore this is really somewhat irresponsible. Having said that, there are some, I've mentioned gastroscopy, and I will go through this a little bit again. It is important for people to realize that gastroscopy does not have to replace oral feeding. In other words, it's not all or one or the other. So you can have both. If you are taking an hour per feeding, for example, you can take 15 minutes per feeding, and after the feeding by mouth and with a gastroscopy, complete the feed by gastroscopy by using the feeding tube. Gastroscopy, the procedure, the surgical procedure has evolved dramatically over the years. It used to be a relatively major undertaking, particularly if it was combined with a process to obstruct movement back from the stomach into the esophagus and mouth, and that called a fundal plication. We don't do that nearly as often now, and now most of the gastroscopies are so-called percutaneous gastroscopies. They don't require general anesthetic. They're usually done in imaging facilities rather than in surgical suites, and take a few minutes. It's not without risk, but the risks are generally small. It's reliable as a way of delivering nutrients and particularly water. And as I mentioned before, it frees time and decreases the anxiety around feeding. I think that from the standpoint of emotion, however, the emotional aspects of feeding, the important thing to take home is that this does not have to replace oral feeding. You can still, and I have many families where the feeding tube is only used during acute intercurrent illness, which, by the way, is another advantage, is that at a time when a child has a flu or a cold or a fever, and particularly the liquid requirements increase, they're also less inclined to feed. So having a gastrostomy provides a way of giving liquids in these situations. But you can close it off. You can, after it matures and switch to a button, the children can go swimming. It's not contraindicated. A word finally about GJ tube, or jejunostomy, or jejunal tube. The jejunum is that part of the small intestine just beyond the duodenum. This is sometimes used if vomiting or reflux is intractable, because if you advance the tube, it's very easy. You just push the tube a little further, it goes into the upper part of the small intestine. But the technique has to change. You cannot use bolus feedings with the JT tube. It has to be a constant infusion, and therefore it involves the use of a pump, and virtually 24 hours a day. I should also mention that with a gastrostomy, one of the things you can do is deliver feedings while the child is asleep. So you can deliver, 50% of the child's nutrient requirements while the child is sleeping. There are some precautions that you need to take to ensure that the child doesn't aspirate. For example, unlike a GJ tube, which is further down the intestine, you cannot use a pump with a gastrostomy unless you're present, or the child is awake, because of the dangers of it becoming dislodged and the child aspirating. So with that, I would entertain any questions that anybody else. GJ tube, yes. GJ just means gastrostomy means gastric, means stomach. Jejunum means the jejunum, that is the upper part of the small intestine. And that tube, gastrostomy, the tube normally ends in the stomach. The GJ tube, the tube is advanced past the stomach into the small intestine. And the problem with it is it's really easy to do, but the technique of feeding after that is quite different. You can't bolus feed. You have to be more careful about the constitution of the diet, because diarrhea may become a big problem with the jejunal, the GJ tube. So I think that in all my experience, it's only been necessary a handful of times compared